So next up in our topic lecture series, the inimitable Sean Kennedy, a former top 5 NDT first round debater, so one of the top 5 teams in the country. His senior year in college debate. It's a very impressive accomplishment, really difficult to do. Turns out only 5 teams get to do it per year. He's currently the coach at, or one of the coaches at University of Kansas. Had an excellent team over the past several years, in part because of his high quality coaching. He is also the DDI's resident fashionista, as you can probably tell from this morning's ensemble. So he's here to talk to you about competitiveness theories of different political economy issues in relationship to education. I think it'll be good stuff. It's what he does a lot of his doctoral research on. So it's a topic that he knows a great deal about, and pay close attention.
Okay, so as kind of a background thing, this is not really a term that people use or a phrase as much in the United States as in some other places. So raise your hand if you've heard or know the definition of the term political economy. Okay, what do you know about political economy?
It's more of a combination of like standard economics, like supply side, demand side, and how it relates to like the political sphere. Like politicians don't necessarily like supply side policies, or they don't like demand side policies because they perceive one as being considerably risky to hurt their chances at real.
I think that's a really good definition. That's a very accurate description. So political economy deals with what was your name? I'm sorry, that was really
Roman?
Right, exactly what was just said. I think that's a very good description. A combination of politics, which is, in the United States and a lot of other electoral democracies, is an issue of voting, gaining power by convincing the public to support you, and also economics. So supply and demand, and other relationships to material goods, and even in this, as we're going to talk about in a minute, in this case, even immaterial goods like ideas and intellectual property. So in political economy, you're dealing with nation states and their political systems. Some of them may be representative. We're just starting, so it's not even some of them may be representative. In the U.S., for example, we have a representative democracy, so we're electing people to represent the public. In other places, they may not necessarily be representative democracies. Many of you at least, debated on the China topic last year. China is not really a representative democracy in the same fashion as the U.S. is. And there's a lot of countries that aren't in the context of political economy. Not everybody's an electoral democracy. And you're dealing with the relationship between those governmental systems, what politicians want, what the populations want, how you can convince them to support you, or at least not overthrow you. And also systems of material goods and their transfer, or like I said, even immaterial goods, like ideas, or concepts, or blueprints, or whatever else. So involved in this process of political economy are people. There is geography and territory and the way that affects things, climate change and adaptation, what you can grow in your territory, whether it's hot or cold in your territory, the amount of rainfall, and whether you have a drought or a famine. So those things are involved too. There's also institutional rules. So not only the rules of a particular nation state, but treaties between states, free trade agreements, the World Trade Organization and the Dispute Settlement Board governs some forms of relation between countries, albeit not very well a lot of the time. It also deals with material goods, like I said. So what resources you have. Do you have gold or rare earth minerals or whatever other things you need to extract out of the ground? It deals with money and currencies. How much is your currency worth versus how much another currency is worth? And it deals with narratives. What are the stories that we're telling? Not just in terms of the law and the way that it characterizes the relationship, say, for example, between the U.S. and China, but also the stories that people are telling in public and to each other. Business people are telling, that educational systems are telling, that people in the public are having reported to them through the media or reporting through their own media, through Twitter and Facebook and whatever else. So one of the important things about political economy that we're about to talk about in just a second is that the stories that are being told about this very complex soup of relationships between people and nation states, the stories that are being told about that make a big difference to how it actually looks in the longer term. And they sort of shape where this whole thing is going. So the way that you want to think about political economy, the thing that's kind of mind-blowing sometimes, is that there's nothing at the very top of the pyramid. It's all being thought about and argued about and sorted out in real time on the same battlefield, and it's unclear at any given time who exactly is going to win out in this contest to decide what the shape of the planet's political, economic system is going to look like, how much we're going to consume, who's going to get which resources, who's going to be doing the best at any given time. So that's all, we're thinking about it and offering ideas about it at the very same time that we're actually doing it. We're writing debate arguments and arguing about ideas at the same time that we're actually consuming goods, going to Novak and buying X amount of coffee or Y number of bagels. So those things are all happening simultaneously. Does that kind of make sense to everybody so far? Okay, anybody really confused already? It's okay to say yes. Ask me a question. Give me something that you're confused about.
Sort of how an economy, or at least politically, is going to be involved with so many different factors at such a grand level.
So part of the thing that you have to sort of wrap your mind around, that it's very hard to understand because you can't really understand it. You can only understand it abstractly, not in the actual way that it works, is that nobody really understands all of these processes at the same time, if that makes sense. So everybody kind of is working, people or governments are sort of working independently and doing their best from their own perspective to solve problems. So for example, the person who's the education secretary does not necessarily understand what's going on with currency policy. Does that make sense? Betsy Ross doesn't know anything about how the yuan is valued. She has no clue. Partly it's a reflection on her, and partly it's a reflection on how complex the whole system is. So the person who works, my brother works for the Federal Trade Commission right now. He doesn't know anything about, agricultural policy in, Guatemala. Does that make sense? Even though those things are interrelated with one another. So none of the people involved, this stuff's all happening at the same time, but there's no one person who really knows everything that's going on. Does that make sense? And that's why I say you can only really grasp it abstractly. So we're imagining that all these things are going on, but you could read, 100 books a day for the rest of your life, and you still wouldn't understand everything that's going on at the same time. Does that kind of make sense? It's a little too complex for any one person to capture at a given time, but you just want to be thinking that abstractly, somewhere kind of in the background, all of this trade and promotion of ideas and discussion and rule following and rule breaking and norm creation is happening all at the same time. And at any given time, we're only dealing with a little slice of it. Unfortunately, all we're going to talk about this in the context of, in about 2 seconds, is education policy. So it's going to go from something very abstract and very big to something much smaller and more narrow. And then we're going to get into the realm of ideas and concepts that one or a handful of people really could hope to understand. Does that make sense? Good question. Thank you for asking that. And don't feel shy at all about just putting your hand up and saying, this is not making any sense. You're just talking nonsense. I will not be able to do that at all. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is competitiveness. How many of you, raise your hand if you've ever encountered a team reading an advantage about competitiveness? Okay, so some of you already have. I guarantee you that by the end of the season, if we were to come back here at the very end of your entire debate season and I asked that question, every single one of you would raise your hand, because everybody is going to be reading advantages about competitiveness. Not literally everybody, but there will be, at any given tournament that you debate at, no matter whether it's at the most local circuit with only lay judges, or whether you're at the sort of most competitive national tournament, there's going to be people reading advantages about competitiveness. So first, this is kind of the big concept. The big picture concept that we're talking about in terms of international political economy. Competitiveness is a theory that really gained prominence in the late 1970s and early 1980s in international business literature, so people who study business. The field of political economy didn't even really come into existence in its current form until the late 1970s, when there was a major crisis with OPEC, which is the, I always forget what the acronym stands for, but basically the major oil producing nations, many of which are in the Middle East, some of which are in other places as well. And basically those countries threatened to cut off supply of oil to the US, and it caused a major political crisis. And people had never really thought about international economics as a political problem. They've been thinking about political problems and economic problems as two separate things. So roughly at the same time that international political economy became a field of study in a really self-conscious, self-aware sense, the theory of competitiveness was also starting to come into prominence about the same time. Basically, the theory of competitiveness in its initial form, and this is not the way that it looks now, so if you're like, that doesn't seem like what I understand it to be, there's a good reason for that. Well, maybe not a good reason, but you're on the right track. Competitiveness meant basically national leaders trying to make the biggest and most important companies in their countries competitive. So think in the 1980s, early 1980s and mid-1980s, Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan trying to make an American company like General Electric or General Motors competitive, trying to do what they can to make that company successful on the international stage. Does that make sense? Those are huge companies. Or another one that's very famous is Lockheed Martin, basically an aerospace company that makes planes, a lot of which are sold directly to the military, the Department of Defense. So you're trying to make these big companies competitive. That's the goal of competitiveness theory. And so there's a whole bunch of different people talking about ways in which we can organize our economy to make those companies more competitive with the companies of other countries. So competitiveness in the initial stage is about competition between major companies in each country. That makes sense to everybody so far? Companies in countries. And at just sort of like a visceral level, you can sort of see how that makes sense. You're kind of like, well, okay, I guess I sort of get that. You know, if you have a bunch of big companies in your country, those companies can employ people in the country. They pay people relatively good wages because they're very powerful. You know, especially in the 1980s, a lot of the jobs in the United States were in manufacturing, so people worked in factories. And the principle was sort of that if you worked in one of these places, like a General Motors factory, they'd pay you relatively well. You'd probably make, you know, $12 or $13 or $14 an hour, maybe a little bit less then, but the wages were pretty good. And you have health care and you work for that company basically for your entire life. So there's kind of a mutual relationship of obligation between the employee, who's going to be a company person, and the company who's going to take care of their employee. And a lot of those jobs, especially in the 1980s in manufacturing, were unionized jobs. So people who worked for General Electric or especially General Motors, if you know, I mean, if you all spend any time in Detroit, a lot of the people there are unionized and work for an auto union. And a lot of the jobs in the US at that time were unionized. Much greater number of jobs were unionized then. So if you were worried about the company not taking care of you and breaking their end of their bargain, they had to deal with the union who had your back if something was going wrong. So if they didn't give you your health care or whatever, well, it's not just you bargaining with the company, there's a huge union behind you kind of defending. Okay? So it kind of makes sense to people so far? So the principle is if we make those companies competitive, if the government is sort of helping those companies out, and those companies are helping their workers out, then in general, people in the US are kind of doing okay. It doesn't really follow exactly, but until the late 1970s, early 1980s, wages from the end of World War II through the late 1970s were mostly going up for people in the bottom quartile, like 20-ish percent, quintile, sorry, 20% of the people in the income distribution. So if you didn't have a lot of money, you could expect that by the end of your life, you'd have a job that would pay you better than it paid your parents would pay, if that makes sense. So there was some upward mobility. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, that trend really stopped. And if you look at the wage data, basically people in the bottom 20% of the income distribution have either very slowly, very, very, bless you, much, much more slowly increased the amount of wages they have, or their wages have gone down as they did after the Great Recession in 2008. So there was kind of this implicit bargain that competitiveness described between big companies in a country and the workforce. And the bargain was, workers, you can expect that your wages will go up a little bit, but in exchange, both the nation state and the workers have to have some allegiance to the companies. They have to kind of have their back in political matters. Does that make sense to everybody so far? Okay. So that's the implicit bargain that's going on. Now, in the mid to late 1980s, there's a shift in what competitiveness theory means. And that shift is partially brought about as a result of several trends that are occurring. One is that barriers to trade start to decrease. So many of you all from the China topic, if you know, some of you that are second years, maybe this is still a little bit confusing or a little bit in the dark about it, but essentially, in the mid to late 1980s, trade barriers between countries started to fall. So, for example, the U.S. is not putting nearly as many tariffs, or almost none, on cars that are getting imported to the U.S. from South Korea or Japan. Yeah, Turner?
What's a tariff?
Oh, sorry, yeah, thank you. A tariff is basically just like a tax. So let's say, for just the sake of absolute simplicity, General Motors sells a car for $1,000, and there's another car that's coming in from Japan that's $1,000. Let's say that the car from Japan is a nicer car. You know, the General Motors one in the 1980s does not have air conditioning. The one from Japan has air conditioning. So same price, but the Japanese one's a better car. Does that make sense? It's got air conditioning. Yeah, that sounds good to me. Don't like to drive in the summer with the air AC off. So you think, okay, well, I want to buy this car from Japan for $1,000. It's nicer. So what's the government do? Well, it's got an implicit bargain with General Motors. We're supposed to be trying to protect the workers. So what are you going to do? Well, maybe you put a tariff on the Japanese car. So that means that when the car comes in, let's say it's from Toyota, we put a 20% tariff on the car. So that means on top of the price, we're adding another 20%. So that car is now worth what? $1,250? Is that right? My math terrible there? Okay, yeah. I'm terrible at it. So that car is now cost $1,250. Does that make sense? Well, now it's a lot more expensive relative to the one that's in the U.S. The GM car is $1,000. The other one's $1,250. So yeah, you can get the one that has the nicer feature, but it's going to cost you more money. Does that make sense? And in a lot of times, a lot of cases, the prices are even more dramatic than that. If that makes sense. I'm just using this as an illustration. A car then probably did not cost. A new car would not cost $1,000. It'd be more than that. So a tariff is a tax that you're putting on another country's exports or things that you are importing. Does that make sense? If we're the U.S., imports are taxed or exports from Japan are being taxed, particularly cars. Does that make sense? And the motivation, I'll get to you in just one second, and the motivation for that is that we're supposed to be trying to protect General Motors, which is important for the U.S. workers. Yes, your question.
The importer at the data tax and the consumer pays a higher price, or how does that?
So usually the way that it works is that the company, Toyota in this case, is the one that's paying it, but they will just pass the cost along to the consumer. That's long story short. So you're gonna end up paying that money as the person buying the car off the lot. Yeah, that's gonna get translated into the price of the car. So with tariffs, it depends on it's complicated, but it doesn't matter. Long story short, somebody's gonna pay it. It's gonna be you as the person buying the car. Yeah, it'll eventually come to your pocket. So long story short, you use things like tariffs, these taxes on other countries' imports, to the U.S. from other countries. You're putting taxes on those imports to make it so that U.S. companies are more competitive. Does that make sense? This stuff is going on in all different kinds of industries. Well, eventually, we start to get to a point as the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs comes into existence and there's negotiation about trade globally. Don't worry about the dynamics exactly. We start to get to a point where these trade barriers are decreasing. Does that make sense? There's fewer and fewer of these tariffs protecting companies. And the principle used to justify it is, well, if we can get other countries to make an agreement with us that they'll also lower their tariffs, on cars, for example, then General Motors can sell their stuff to people in other countries too. So it'll work out in the end. Does that make sense? Maybe Americans will buy Japanese cars sometimes, but on the other hand, we can sell Brazilians American cars. So it'll all work out as long as everybody agrees to lower their tariffs. Does that make sense? So over time, these trade barriers start to decrease. It takes a lot of political negotiation. It's still not a completed process. There's still a lot of tariffs in different places. But generally speaking, these trade barriers start to go down. And there's less and less taxes being levied on imports and exports. Does that make sense? A second thing that starts to happen is that increasingly countries are allowing what they call high-skilled immigration. So they're creating special visas or special documents to get you into the country that allow people with particular educational qualifications to get in. Does that make sense? This process starts kind of in the late 1980s. It becomes at least more prominent in the late 1980s, and kind of continues into the 1990s. Prior to, and it's very hard to understand this now in our contemporary political climate, but prior to the mid-1980s, and it's ebbed and flowed at various points throughout history, but in the post-World War II period, immigration was very high into the United States, and there was not nearly as much political anger about immigration as there is now. The contemporary thing where we say all this really, frankly racist stuff about undocumented immigrants, that really kicked back into gear in fervor in the mid-1980s, roughly, around the time that Ronald Reagan was first in office. So that fervor of kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric did not really start in the way that we understand it now until relatively recently. Granted, there was plenty of other periods in history where the U.S. has had some super racist immigration policies, but not on a widespread scale, if that makes sense. This is like just general anger, we don't like immigrants. You see what I'm saying? There's a Chinese Exclusion Act, there's a bunch of other really racist, like anti-Asian Exclusion Acts. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the history of immigration was just easy peasy, no problem, everybody's fine. But the tone changed to a kind of general anti-immigrant fervor, okay? In keeping with that, though, and in part to justify continued immigration, a lot of politicians, activists, political leaders said, well, what about these people that are coming into the U.S. that are really smart? What do we do about that? Those people they should deserve to come in. So part of what the U.S. and in fact many other countries started to do was they said, you can come into the country if you have documents and if you have some level of educational qualification. And oftentimes it was that you do something in, we'll talk about it in a second, in a high-tech field. So if you're a software engineer, or you have a PhD in computer science, or you have maybe an MA in microbiology, and you're going to develop some patents, then we'll let you in. So there are visas that are set aside for people with a certain level of educational qualification. Does that make sense? So on the one hand, the U.S. is really pushing back against immigrants. It's super intense anti-immigrant rhetoric. On the other hand, we're letting in more people that have a certain level of educational qualification. Does that make sense? So general decrease in immigration, but an increase, a very large increase in a very specific kind of immigration. Does that make sense? So net decrease, but increases in specific fields. Yes?
Are these two things that you described, like closing of tariffs and allowing slogan, is this like the beginning of globalization?
Kind of, yeah. The one thing that, so that's a really complicated question. It's a really good question. In truth, no, it's not. Globalization has been around for literally hundreds of years, but it wasn't thought of as globalization. So if you think about it, colonialism, chattel slavery, those things are globalization. A really dark form of globalization, but that's what they are. So those things have been around for a long time. The difference is that people started to understand them as globalization. Does that make sense? So the concept of globalization as a theoretical idea, like I said, a narrative, is a relatively recent narrative. Does that make sense? That is relatively new. The actual fact of globalization has been around for hundreds of years in some really dark and violent forms. So yeah, people start to think of this as globalization. So there's a decrease, like I said, there's a decrease of tariffs. There is an increase in high-skilled migration and in governing immigration policy according to the skills of the people who are migrating, okay? The third thing that's happening in competitiveness that's really important is that increasingly there's no barriers to the movement of capital, okay? Capital is a little bit different than trade. So with trade, you're talking about consumer goods, cars, refrigerators, toasters. Capital, we're talking more about money, so currency, and the way that currency is moved. Granted, that separation is a little bit artificial, okay? It's not super clear, but usually there are in fact, different laws that regulate the movement of currency than that regulate the movement of goods, okay? So it becomes easier and easier if you're a business person in the U.S., maybe you own a hedge fund, or you're in finance, or a stock trader, to move your money from the US to China or to the European Union or to South America. And you can trade your dollars in for another currency and keep your money in a different set of banks. Does that make sense? Previously, there were taxes on the movement of money as well that were sometimes very strong. Increasingly, movement of currencies and capital, just cash basically, becomes more and more deregulated. Okay? So we're in a world now where people that have a certain level of educational qualification, you know, PhD in computer science or whatever, those people can move. Money can move very easily, and goods are moving much more easily. Does that make sense? So goods, money, and people, a very specific kind of people are moving much more easily. Okay? So this creates a shift in what is meant by competitiveness. And frankly, a shift that the people who are writing in this literature are not very honest about occurring. This just like happens, but nobody's really noticing that what we used to mean by competitiveness, a basic bargain between a company in the United States and its workers and the government, that kind of triangle structure where each of them take care of the others, that we've shifted. And now competitiveness is not about countries trying to make their companies competitive to help their workers. It's about countries competing with one another. Countries in competition, not companies. Countries in competition with one another to attract businesses and to keep them in their country. Okay? This is a big shift, and the implications of it are hard to grasp, but it's really important. So what's happening is that countries increasingly have to try and convince companies to come there and to stay there. And the reason why is that as the people involved, the high-skilled people involved can move, as the money can move, and as the goods can move, companies kind of look up and say, well, we could be anywhere. You know, why don't we just open a factory in, a US company might say we could open a factory in Mexico, or Taiwan, or Brazil, or wherever else. It doesn't matter, it's Sweden. There's no barriers to us doing that. So they say, okay, well, increasingly what we can say to the US government is, if you pass these environmental regulations on our car production, on our factories, you stop us from doing what we want, then we'll just move to another country. Does that make sense? We'll just go to Brazil and open a factory there. Who cares? So the countries now are placed in a position where they're sort of being held hostage, that they kind of have to do whatever these companies say in order to keep their business there, in order to ensure that their workers have high wages. The problem is that while you say on the one hand, well, you want to keep the big companies there so you have workers who are employed and have high wages, on the other hand, because these companies can go wherever they want, they can justify passing laws to decrease the number of unions that are protecting workers. They can justify paying some of their workers less money. Because now they can say, well, if these people don't want to work for $9 an hour, then we can just go to another country where people work for $6 an hour. Does that make sense? So increasingly, while countries are desperate to keep the companies there, to keep General Motors there, they run the risk that if those companies, if the workers and the businesses don't, you run the risk, basically, more simply put, you run the risk that if workers in the United States do not give in to the demands of companies, then the company will just leave and go somewhere else. Does that make sense? So wages start to fall, union protections start to go down, and the economy becomes increasingly deregulated to create a climate that is more beneficial to the businesses, or at least that fits with what they want. It may not necessarily be better for the businesses, that's an open question of debate, but it fits with what they want. Does that make sense? So now, whereas before, workers and the national government, the elected officials were kind of driving the bus, now the companies are the ones driving the bus. Does that make sense? And the focus is on attractiveness of the country to companies, to businesses, to corporations. Okay? Everybody following me so far? And in part, that's because of these three structural trends. Increasing high-skilled migration, increasing ability for capital to move, and decreasing barriers to trade, increasing ability for goods to move. Make sense to people? Okay, so that's just competitiveness theory. There's a lot of problems with this, many of which will be talked about in more detail. Just very briefly, to summarize one of the biggest ones, because the generic group that I'm doing is neoliberalism, and we're going to spend some time talking about that as a file. I'll do an elective on it, so I don't want to spend too much time on the criticism elements of that, because there'll be other opportunities if you're interested to talk about that a little bit more. But one of the big problems with this concept of competitiveness, of competing between, of having countries compete to try and attract corporations, the big problem you get into is that there's a real contradiction at the heart of all of this, okay? On the one hand, the theory driving the removal of trade barriers and the increasing movement of capital and high-skilled people is a theory called comparative advantage that comes from this economist named Adam Smith. Wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. That's where a lot of this theory comes from, comparative advantage. It actually comes from a political economist from Egypt named Ibn Khaldun, but who cares? People are racist, so they forget about that. So anyway, comparative advantage. The theory of comparative advantage basically says that it's advantageous, even if the US is better at making computers and at growing wheat than Brazil, it's good for the US to have a free trade agreement with Brazil, because we are so much relatively better at making computers than we are relatively better at growing wheat, that Brazil can grow the wheat and the US will build the computers and the market will be more efficient. Does that make sense? So it's about comparative advantage. What is the relative extent to which you have an advantage in each industry, okay? The basic theory behind this is, if you make free trade a thing, there's very low barriers to trade. You can move goods and money across countries, borders really easily. If you do that, then what will happen is that the production of the goods will get more efficient, and as production of the goods gets more efficient, the prices will go down, and so things are cheaper for consumers. So you might think to yourself, well, it's bad for me if I work in, wheat and agriculture, and Brazil takes all of the jobs in that industry. True, but the theory is, while it's bad for you as a wheat farmer, it's good for everybody else in the US, because now bread's cheaper for everybody. Does that make sense? That's the principle. There's a lot of problems with that theory, but that's the principal concept behind it, okay? So comparative advantage theory says we want to have relatively low barriers to trade. We want to make trade easy, because then we'll have a system in which everything's being efficiently produced globally. Each country will sort of have a niche market of a handful of things that it produces really well, and it'll trade with the other countries to kind of fill in. It's the basic theory behind it, right? And the theory that one of the big things that Smith particularly was harping on was that the idea that countries should try to beggar their neighbors, should try to be so much, try to basically make it so that they're selling stuff to other places but not buying from them. That concept is silly, because it turns what could be a cooperative system into a really rivalrous and really nasty system. Not just that it's competitive, but that it's nasty. That each country is saying, I want to buy as little as I can from you and buy as much from my own country. Does that make sense? So a lot of this rhetoric of buy America and America first, that's actually sort of the concept that Adam Smith is criticizing. Is that concept of economic nationalism. Does that make sense? Okay, well, here's the problem. On the one hand, competitiveness theory is saying we need to decrease barriers to trade, make it easier for companies to move into the country, make it easier for smart people to come into our country, et cetera, et cetera.